My stepmother Victoria smirked as she locked me out of my childhood estate with nothing but a trash bag and my father's rusty tackle box. She thought she had successfully stolen his billionaire empire and left me to freeze to death in my beat-up car. She had no idea that tackle box held the precise key to her destruction. As her armed hitman's boots violently thudded up the stairs of the decaying Wisconsin farmhouse, I twisted that silver key into the massive hidden attic vault. The heavy steel door groaned open to reveal millions in gold, and the toxicology reports proving she murdered him. She thought she had buried a helpless teenager, but she just handed me a war chest. The rain in Lake Forest, Illinois, has a specific kind of coldness to it in late October. It doesn't just wet your skin. It seeps directly into your bones. That was the day Victoria, my stepmother, decided my time was up. I stood on the sweeping limestone porch of the $14 million estate I had called home for my entire life, clutching a black, heavy-duty trash bag. Inside were a few pairs of jeans, some t-shirts, and my father's old green fishing tackle box, the only item I had managed to grab from his study before the security guards physically escorted me down the stairs. Victoria stood safely behind the glass of the double front doors, draped in a cashmere shawl that probably cost more than a reliable used car. Beside her was her biological son, Preston. He was 22, freshly graduated from an Ivy League school my father had paid for, and he wore a smirk that I will never ever forget. "You're 19, Samuel." Victoria's voice had oozed through the crack in the door before she closed it for good. "Legally an adult. Your father is gone and the free ride is over. The estate belongs to me now. If you set foot on this property again, I will have you arrested for trespassing." Then the deadbolt clicked. The finality of that sound echoed in my ears as I walked down the long, sweeping driveway, the rain plastering my hair to my forehead. My father, Robert Wyatt, had built a massive logistics software company from the ground up. He was a brilliant man, but his fatal flaw was his heart, both literally and metaphorically. He loved too easily, which is how Victoria, a former corporate consultant with a gaze like shattered ice, wormed her way into our lives 5 years ago. 6 months ago, my father suffered a massive coronary failure. It was sudden, devastating. The real shock, however, came during the reading of the will. Ted Higgins, the family lawyer who had attended my little league games and eaten at our Thanksgiving table for a decade, wouldn't even look me in the eye. He stared at his legal pad, his voice devoid of emotion as he announced that my father had revised his will a mere 3 weeks before his death. The new document left everything: the company, the real estate, the liquid assets, the offshore accounts entirely to Victoria. I was left with a single insulting clause: a one-time payout of $10,000, which Victoria subsequently claimed was tied up in probate and refused to disperse. I was effectively ruined. For the first 2 weeks, I lived in my beat-up 2008 Honda Civic. I parked in the back corners of 2 4-hour Walmart parking lots, rationing cheap crackers and peanut butter, waking up shivering at 3 a.m. with the windows frosted over from my own breath. The sheer betrayal paralyzed me. How could my father, who used to call me his anchor, leave me to starve on the streets? It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. It wasn't until my 3rd week of living in the Civic that I finally opened the green tackle box. I was sitting under the dim, flickering amber light of a street lamp, the engine idling to squeeze a few minutes of heat into the cabin. I unlatched the rusty metal clasps of the box, expecting to find nothing but tangled fishing wire, dried-out rubber worms, and rusty hooks from our trips to Lake Michigan. I ran my fingers over the plastic dividers, tears pricking my eyes as the smell of stale lake water and old metal brought back memories of a time when my life felt secure. But as I pressed down on the bottom tray, it shifted. I froze. I pushed the plastic divider again. It gave way with a soft Times click. My heart began to hammer in my chest. I wedged my car keys under the edge of the plastic and pried it upward. A false bottom. Beneath the tray, resting on the dark green plastic, was a small velvet pouch and a folded piece of yellow legal paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. It was my father's handwriting, rushed, slanted, almost frantic. "Sammy, if you are reading this, the worst has happened. Victoria 1. Do not trust Ted Higgins. They have been maneuvering against me for months, and my heart medication makes my head too foggy to fight them in the boardroom. I know they are doctoring the legal documents. I don't have much time. I left you nothing on paper because she would find a way to take it. Go to the First National Bank downtown. Box 402. Use this. I love you, son. Look up, Dad." I dumped the velvet pouch into my palm. Out slid a sleek silver safety deposit box key. The next morning, I used the last 2 gallons of gas in my tank to drive to downtown Chicago. I walked into the grand marble lobby of the First National Bank, wearing wrinkled clothes and 3 days of beard stubble. The bank manager eyed me with deep suspicion, but I had my driver's license and the key. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a private viewing room with a long metal box resting on the mahogany table in front of me. I opened the lid. Inside, there was no stack of cash. There were no gold bars. There was only a single manila folder. I opened it to find a property deed registered to a shell company called Blue Heron Holdings, LLC. Attached to it was a notarized document naming me as the sole proprietor of the LLC, effectively hiding my ownership from any personal probate searches Victoria might have run. The property was located in Black River Falls, a heavily forested rural area in central Wisconsin. Also in the folder was a brass key with a piece of masking tape on it that read, "Front Door." I stared at the deed. A property in Wisconsin. I had never heard my father mention Black River Falls in my end of life. Why would a billionaire tech mogul own a secret property in the middle of nowhere? I didn't have money, but I had a destination. I pawned my father's old fishing reels at a local shop for $80, filled up my gas tank, bought a loaf of bread, and pointed my car north. The drive took 5 hours. By the time I crossed the Wisconsin border, the gray clouds had thickened, casting a gloomy, oppressive twilight over the dense pine forests. The GPS coordinates led me off the interstate down a winding county highway, and eventually onto an unmarked, unpaved logging road that threatened to tear the suspension right out from under my Civic. I drove for another 3 miles, the branches of overgrown oaks scraping against my windows like skeletal fingers. Finally, the trees broke, revealing a small, overgrown clearing. I parked the car and killed the engine. The silence of the deep woods rushed in, thick and heavy. I stepped out, my boots sinking into damp, decaying leaves, and stared at my inheritance. It was a massive letdown. I don't know what I had been expecting. A sleek, modern bunker, a luxurious hidden cabin. Instead, sitting in the center of the clearing, was a dilapidated 2-story A-frame farmhouse. The white paint was peeling off the siding and long curled strips. One of the front windows was boarded up, and the porch roof sagged dangerously in the middle. It looked like it had been abandoned for 20 years. "This is it," I whispered to the empty woods. "This is the safe house." A wave of bitter disappointment washed over me. Maybe my dad's mind really had been deteriorating. Maybe this was just a worthless piece of junk real estate he had forgotten about. But I had driven all this way, and I literally had nowhere else to go. I walked up the creaking wooden steps of the porch, half expecting my foot to plunge through the rotting planks. I pulled the brass key from my pocket, inserted it into the rusty deadbolt, and turned. It was stiff, but it clicked. I pushed the door open. The hinges shrieked in protest. The smell of stale air, mildew, and dust hit me instantly. I pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a living room frozen in time. Furniture was covered in thick white canvas sheets, yellowed with age. There were raccoon droppings in the corner and a thick layer of dust coating the hardwood floors. I walked slowly into the room, my footsteps echoing hollowly. "Dad," I mumbled, feeling foolish. As I swept my flashlight across the floor toward the kitchen, my breath caught in my throat. I stopped dead in my tracks. The dust on the floor was thick, like a carpet of grey snow, but cutting straight through the middle of the living room leading toward the back hallway was a set of footprints. They weren't my footprints. Mine were the flat treads of cheap sneakers by the door. These prints were large, deeply grooved, like heavy tactical boots, and the edges of the displaced dust were sharp. They were fresh. Someone had been here recently, within the last few days. My heart hammered against my ribs, echoing in my ears. The immediate thought was Victoria. She was ruthless. If she had suspected my father was hiding assets, she absolutely would have hired a private investigator to track down any shell companies. Had they beaten me here? Had they already stripped the place of whatever my father wanted me to find? I reached into my pocket and gripped my car keys, threading them between my knuckles as an improvised weapon. I moved as silently as I could, following the boot prints down the narrow hallway. They led into what appeared to be an old study. The canvas sheet had been violently ripped off a heavy oak desk. The drawers were pulled out, papers scattered carelessly across the floor. The intruder had been searching for something. I stepped over the mess, my mind racing. If they had found what they were looking for, they wouldn't have left the place trashed like this. They were frustrated. They missed something. I remembered the note in the tackle box. "I love you, son. Look up." I shined my flashlight at the ceiling of the study. It was flat, ordinary drywall, nothing hidden. I followed the boot prints back out into the hallway. They went up the stairs. I crept up the wooden steps, wincing at every groan of the floorboards. The second floor consisted of a small bathroom and a master bedroom. The boot prints paced all around the bedroom, stopping at the closet and then headed back out toward the stairs. The intruder had left. I walked into the master bedroom. It was bare except for a mattress on the floor and a large walk-in closet with the door left wide open. I walked into the closet, feeling a cold draft brush against the back of my neck. "Look up." I aimed the beam of my phone straight up. The closet ceiling was paneled with cheap acoustic tiles, the kind you see in old office buildings, but one of the tiles in the far corner, right above a built-in wooden shelf, looked slightly off-center. There was a tiny gap showing a sliver of total darkness above. I climbed onto the wooden shelf, the wood groaning under my weight. I reached up and pressed my palms flat against the acoustic tile. I pushed. The tile lifted easily, sliding to the side with a dusty scrape. A cascade of dry rot and dust fell into my eyes, making me cough violently. I waved the dust away and shined my light into the hole. There was a heavy aluminum drop-down ladder resting just inside the opening. The intruder hadn't looked up. They hadn't seen the shifted tile. With shaking hands, I grabbed the bottom rung of the ladder and pulled it down. It extended with a series of metallic clanks that sounded like gunshots in the quiet house. I took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and began to climb into the pitch-black attic. The air up here was stifling, smelling heavily of cedar and old paper. I crested the opening and pulled myself up onto the sturdy plywood floor of the attic. I stood up, holding my phone out like a beacon. The attic was massive, spanning the entire length of the house. I swept the light from left to right. It was mostly empty, save for a few cardboard boxes. But as the beam of light hit the far corner of the room, it reflected off something massive and metallic. It was a safe, not a small hotel room lockbox. This was a colossal 6-foot-tall brushed steel vault, bolted directly into the load-bearing beams of the house. It looked like it belonged in a high-security bank, not a rotting cabin in Wisconsin. I sprinted toward it, my boots thudding against the plywood. As I got closer, the sheer scale of the thing took my breath away. It had a heavy steel wheel and a digital keypad. But as my flashlight illuminated the front of the vault, my stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. The digital keypad had been smashed to pieces. Wires dangled uselessly from the shattered plastic casing, and the thick steel surrounding the lock mechanism was scarred and scored with deep blackened grooves. Someone had taken an angle grinder and a sledgehammer to it. The intruder times had times found the attic. They times had times found the safe. I fell to my knees in front of the massive steel door, my heart shattering all over again. Victoria's goons had destroyed the lock. They had trapped whatever was inside forever. I was completely, utterly ruined until I looked closer at the keypad. Taped to the side of the scorched metal was a tiny, pristine sticky note with a familiar, frantic handwriting. "Sammy, if the keypad is broken, look behind the panel." My fingers hovered over the tiny yellowed sticky note. "If the keypad is broken, look behind the panel." My heart thumped a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I pulled my cheap folding pocket knife from my jeans, wedged the thin blade behind the shattered plastic housing of the digital keypad, and pried. The ruined plastic popped off with a sharp snap, sending shards clattering to the plywood floor. Behind the housing, flush against the cold steel of the vault, was a perfectly round mechanical keyhole. My mind raced. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the brass key for the front door. But that was too large. Then I remembered the bank. I pulled out the sleek silver safety deposit box key. The bank manager hadn't asked for it back. In fact, she had seemed eager to get me out of her lobby. With trembling hands, I slid the silver key into the hidden lock. It slid in effortlessly. I held my breath and turned it. Clack! A heavy, satisfying mechanical thud echoed from deep within the 6-foot vault. I grabbed the massive steel wheel on the front of the door, braced my boots against the floorboards, and pulled. The hinges groaned, a sound of heavy friction that hadn't been disturbed in years, and the thick door swung open. The beam of my flashlight illuminated the interior, and I actually had to brace myself against the wall to keep from falling over. There was money, stacks of it, shrink-wrapped bricks, of $100 bills lined the bottom shelf alongside velvet pouches, heavy with what I later learned were solid gold Krugerrands. It was a literal fortune, enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But my father was a man of strategy. He knew that cash alone wouldn't give me my life back. It would only make me a target. On the middle shelf, sitting perfectly centered, was a thick black leather-bound journal, 2 encrypted external hard drives, and a heavily sealed manila envelope labeled with one word in my father's unmistakable scrawl: checkmate. I set the flashlight down, ripped open the envelope, and pulled out a stack of documents. The first was a legally binding, heavily witnessed and notarized last will and testament dated a mere 5 days before my father's death. In it, he left absolutely everything: his company, the estate, his entire net worth to me. It explicitly disinherited Victoria and Preston, citing irreconcilable breaches of trust. But the second document made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a private toxicology report from an independent lab in Switzerland, along with a stack of printed emails. I flipped through the pages, my eyes widening in absolute horror. Victoria hadn't just been manipulating my father's business affairs. She had been killing him. The emails were exchanges between Victoria and Ted Higgins, the lawyer I had known since childhood. They had conspired to bribe one of our private estate nurses. For 8 months, they had been subtly replacing my father's vital heart medication with a synthetic, untraceable amphetamine compound. Every time he took his pills, his weakened heart was being pushed to the absolute brink. They were deliberately inducing his coronary failure. My father had figured it out. The journal entries chronicled his terrifying realization, how his mind would clear on days he secretly skipped his medication, how he hired a private investigator to monitor Victoria, and how he desperately scrambled to hide this vault and secure the evidence before his heart finally gave out. He knew Ted Higgins controlled the local police and the probate courts. He needed me to find the truth when they least expected it. I was so absorbed in the horrific revelation that I almost didn't hear it. The crunch of gravel outside. I snapped my flashlight off immediately, plunging the attic into suffocating darkness. I crept to the small, grimy, circular window at the gable end of the attic and peered down into the clearing. A black SUV with tinted windows had parked directly behind my beat-up Civic, blocking me in. The headlights cut through the Wisconsin gloom, illuminating the pouring rain. The driver's side door opened, and a massive man in a dark trench coat and tactical boots stepped out. The boots. It was the intruder. Then the passenger door opened. A man with silver hair and a tailored trench coat stepped into the rain, holding an umbrella. It was Ted Higgins. "The kid's car is here," I heard the heavy-set man say, his voice carrying through the quiet forest. "He must have found the deed." "Then he's inside," Ted replied, his voice devoid of the warm, uncle-like tone I had known my whole life. It was cold, murderous. "Find him, Garrett. If he's seen what's in that safe, he doesn't leave these woods. Make it look like a break-in gone wrong." Panic seized my throat, sharp and metallic. I was 19. I wasn't a fighter. I was a college dropout with a trash bag full of damp clothes. But looking at the journal in my hands, a sudden white-hot fury burned through the fear. They murdered my father. They threw me away like garbage. I was not going to let them win. I heard the heavy thud of the front door being kicked open downstairs. Moving entirely on instinct, I grabbed my empty backpack from the floor. I shoved the gold, the bricks of cash, the hard drives, the toxicology reports, and the real will inside, zipping it tight. I strapped the heavy bag tightly to my chest rather than my back so it wouldn't snag. Heavy tactical footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor below. Thud, thud, thud. "Check the study." Ted's voice echoed up the stairwell. I had seconds. I couldn't go down the ladder. I looked back at the small, circular ventilation window at the end of the attic. It was covered by wooden louvers, brittle and rotting from decades of harsh winters. I scrambled quietly across the plywood floor, ignoring the splinters driving into my palms. The heavy-set man, Garrett, was already walking up the second-floor stairs. I could hear his breathing. I reached the window. I laid flat on my back, brought both of my boots up, and kicked the wooden louvers with every ounce of strength I had left. The wood shattered with a loud, cracking explosion. "He's up there," Garrett yelled from the bedroom, followed instantly by the screech of the metal attic ladder being violently pulled down. I squeezed my shoulders through the broken window frame, the jagged splinters tearing through my shirt and slicing my skin. I wriggled out onto the steeply pitched A-frame roof. The rain was slick, and the moss covering the old shingles offered zero traction. I immediately began to slide toward the edge, a 2-story drop to the overgrown concrete patio below. I scrambled wildly, my fingernails digging into the rotting shingles. I caught myself just inches from the gutter. Inside the attic, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness. "He's on the roof!" Garrett bellowed, his head popping through the broken window. I saw the glint of a suppressed pistol in his right hand. I didn't think. I just rolled off the edge of the roof. I plummeted through the darkness, crashing violently into the thick canopy of a massive oak tree that grew beside the house. Branches whipped across my face, tearing at my clothes and bruising my ribs as I tumbled downward. I slammed into a thick limb, knocking the wind out of my lungs before finally dropping the last 10 feet into a thick patch of wet ferns. Pain exploded in my ankle, but adrenaline flooded my system, numbing the agony. "Shoot him!" Ted screamed from the front porch. Bark exploded from the trunk of the oak tree, inches from my head. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my leg, and sprinted into the dense, pitch-black forest. I didn't run toward my car. I knew it was blocked. Instead, I ran deep into the treine, using the storm and the darkness as cover. I ran for over an hour, navigating entirely by the faint glow of the moon behind the clouds, until I stumbled out onto the paved county highway. I was bleeding, soaked to the bone and shaking violently. But clutched to my chest was the backpack. Just before dawn, a passing long-haul trucker picked me up. He took one look at my bruised face and the sheer desperation in my eyes, asked no questions, and drove me straight to Chicago. I didn't go to the local police. My father's journal had warned me that Ted had influence there. Instead, at 8 a.m., I walked into the downtown field office of the FBI. I demanded to speak to a federal agent regarding a corporate conspiracy and premeditated murder involving a billion-dollar tech conglomerate. Agent Donovan, a stern-faced veteran of the white-collar crime division, initially looked at me like I was a delusional runaway. But the moment I laid the Swiss toxicology reports, the encrypted hard drives, and the real will on his desk, his expression shifted to absolute, stone-cold focus. The takedown was swift, brutal, and entirely public. 3 days later, heavily armed federal agents traded the Lake Forest estate. I sat in an unmarked black sedan down the street, watching through the rain-streaked window. The front doors were thrown open. Victoria, wearing her signature cashmere and diamonds, was escorted out in handcuffs. Her face was pale, twisted in a mask of sheer disbelief as she screamed at the agents to unhand her. Preston was dragged out in his silk pajamas, crying openly as he was shoved into the back of a federal cruiser. Simultaneously, across town, Ted Higgins was arrested in the middle of a high-profile board meeting. The hard drives had contained irrefutable proof, financial transfers to the hitman, Garrett, emails coordinating the tampering of the medication, and a massive offshore embezzlement scheme they had planned to execute. The moment probate cleared, it was over. The nightmare was finally over. 6 months later, the legal dust settled. The courts validated the true will, entirely voiding Victoria's forged documents. She and Ted were indicted for first-degree murder, conspiracy, and federal wire fraud. They will spend the rest of their natural lives in a federal penitentiary. At 20 years old, I officially took control of my father's empire. I fired the corrupt board members, rebuilt the company's executive team with people my father had genuinely trusted, and established a massive medical foundation in his name. But I didn't move back into the Lake Forest mansion. I sold it. It held too many ghosts, too many lies. Instead, I used a fraction of my inheritance to renovate the old A-frame house in Black River Falls. I fixed the roof, repainted the siding, and turned the attic into a sprawling, sunlit library. Sometimes, when the corporate world gets too loud, I drive up to Wisconsin, sit by the fireplace, and look at my father's old green tackle box resting on the mantel. They thought they could break me. They thought stripping me of everything would leave me defenseless, but they forgot one crucial detail. I am Robert Wyatt's son, and when you leave a Wyatt with nothing left to lose, you better be prepared for the storm they bring back. What an absolutely incredible journey of survival, betrayal, and ultimate justice. Samuel's story proves that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't just wealth, but the truth needed to fight back against the darkest of lies. If this thrilling story of a billionaire's son reclaiming his stolen empire kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life stories.